Today, I want to talk about someone that has been described variously as a composer, a band leader, a mystic, a visionary, an eccentric, and a leader of the Afrofuturist movement. And I'm speaking of Sun Ra, and I encountered him before through his music, but more recently I picked up the biography Space is the Place by John Szwed. And Szwed has done an amazing amount of research for this book because it was previously rather difficult for people to get any really hard information about this man, but he did a lot of legwork and was able to unearth a tremendous amount of information about someone who has been shrouded in rumor and mystery for a long time. Now, for those of you who don't know Sun Ra, I can jump right to Wikipedia to make it easy. His real name was Herman Poole Blount, but he was known as Sun Ra, and he legally changed his name to Le Sonnier Ra, and he was an American jazz composer, band leader, piano and synthesizer player, and poet known for his experimental music, cosmic philosophy, prolific output, and theatrical performances. For much of his career, Ra led the orchestra, an ensemble with an ever-changing name and flexible lineup. Now, Sun Ra started his career in a more or less conventional fashion. He was born in 1914 in Birmingham, Alabama, and so his life was circumscribed by racism and by prejudice and by discrimination. But despite all of that, he managed to find himself a place in it. One of the ways that you could do that if you were black was by being an entertainer, in his case, a musician. And he started off in a relatively conventional vein, where he was working with various bands and orchestras in this form or that form. But over time, he started to develop his own crew, and he started to develop his own music, which was informed by jazz and bebop and fusion and ragtime and a lot of other different kinds of music. But they all came together and formed something that was truly unique. And he put together what he described as the orchestra, which was his musical collective, which could have as many as dozens of members at a time. And they would often have quite theatrical getup that they would use in their performances. And they released literally dozens, if not hundreds, of recordings under various names, all of them centering around Sun Ra and his activity. And Sun Ra himself as a man was quite the mystery, because he would often tell people that he was not from this earth. And he claims that in 1936, 1937, thereabouts, that something had happened to him that would basically be described as a mystical experience, but for him had science fiction overtones. He claimed that he had been transported to the planet Saturn, and that he had spoken to aliens, essentially, and that he himself was not of this earth, and that his mission was to bring word of the great cosmic beyond to other human beings. And this he did through his music, and also through many other things that he did in his creative life, his poetry and his writings, his lectures, and so on and so forth. He was basically living out his vision. And he was, as far as anyone could tell, completely sincere about it. He was totally straight. This was not an act. This was not something that he did because he wanted to kid people. But at the same time, he always did it with a bit of a gleam in his eye, as a way of saying, well, I know that you think I'm a little bit nuts, but this is how I reach you. And one of the nice things about Szwed's book is that he goes into a lot of detail about how this worked, individual performances and individual encounters that he had, and how all of these ideas unfolded and changed and took different forms across his career. And so by the time that he finally died in 1993, he had left behind this tremendous legacy, which continues to influence people today. And the remaining band members continue to perform as the orchestra. Although without him, there's still only going to be so much they can continue, in my opinion. But I first encountered him through his music, since I was and remain to this day a big jazz fan. And only later did I find out a lot more about his life. And there just wasn't very much that you could find out unless you encountered something like the Szwed biography. Now, a big part of what Sun Ra has been associated with has been lumped together under the term Afrofuturism. And again, I'm going to drop back to Wikipedia for the quick description. It is a cultural aesthetic philosophy of science and history that explores the intersection of the African diaspora culture with science and technology. My take on it is that it's basically science fiction and fantasy through the lens of African American life, and maybe through the lens of African life generally. And Sun Ra was essentially an embodiment of a lot of Afrofuturist ideas. He was living this stuff out. He was making it a central part of his of his presentation. He wasn't just talking about science fiction in a way, he was trying to actually live it out. So a lot of what we associate with Afrofuturism in mainstream culture can be traced either directly or indirectly back to him, or was made popular because of his presence in certain cultural streams. He wasn't very widely known for a lot of his career, but he influenced a tremendous number of other people. His cosmic concerns predated the UFO craze in this country by probably a good 15 years or more. Now, all of this got me thinking about how in science fiction and fantasy settings, we have a center to the culture and we have fringes. We have a mainstream and we have an avant-garde. And we also have outsiders. And the avant-garde and the outsiders don't necessarily always overlap completely. Sometimes they may be completely distinct from each other. In the United States, for a good part of our history, mainstream American culture was white and Anglo-Saxon. So Sun Ra was an outsider twice over. He was born black, so he was not part of white mainstream culture. And he cultivated these eccentricities that were also not part of mainstream culture. So again, we have a center and we have an outside. And I've always thought that when you create a setting of any kind, a fantastic setting, you need to pay as much attention to the edges as you do the center. What gets pushed out to the edges? Who gets pushed out of the mainstream and why? And when they are out at the edges, what contradictions or extremes do they expose about the mainstream? And when I was reading the Sun Ra biography, there are many points in it where I found myself shaking my head and saying, this is obviously kind of nutty. But the point that I realized I had to accept was that I did not have to believe everything that came out of Sun Ra's mouth, but I did have to see how what he was saying was influenced by his view and by the stance he took and by the position that he occupied in the culture. He didn't have to be right about everything, but he was interesting. And it was the same thing for me about the way that an eccentric or someone who lives on the fringes in a fantasy or science fiction setting should be. They don't have to be correct. Their stance does not have to be necessarily the sanctioned one, but it should be interesting in its own right. It should expose contradictions or extremes that exist in the mainstream themselves. So if there's someone who lives on the fringes in your setting, you want to think about what form that fringe takes. Why does your person live there versus anywhere else? Are they there by choice? Are they there because that is essentially where they were condemned to live because of the accidents of their birth? You know, in Sun Ra's case, it was a little of both. He was both black and eccentric, so the deck was stacked against him twice. And a lot of times when I think about the way that we have gradually found greater legitimacy for eccentricity in mainstream life, we also find ways to pull its fangs. It was easy for us to sit there and look at Sun Ra as an entertainer. Not so easy to look at him as someone with mystic or prophetic qualities. And again, not because he was correct in absolutely everything he said, but because he was showing us things about ourselves that we weren't necessarily going to accept or think about clearly the first time that we heard them. So if you're creating a setting and you want to think about the center and the edges, and I think you should think about the edges at least as much as the center, it's a good idea to look at examples of people in this world, in this life, who existed on the edges, and to figure out why they lived on the edges as they did, what cultural forces put them there, or what choices they made because they figured that was the best place for them. And Sun Ra is one of the better examples that I've come across for this sort of thing, because his life is just so fascinating and because he was basically living science fiction in his own way. So I encourage you to pick up John Szwed's book if any of this sparks your interest. It is available both digitally and in print. I was fond enough of it that I figured the print copy was well worth keeping. And again, give some thought to what it means to be someone on the fringes in the world that you're creating. So again, reading the book is, for me, a good exercise in thinking about how someone exists on the fringes of any world that one might create.